Recruiters are
Right.
they're not looking for, oh, I did this at this internship, but you can't see it because, it's behind a firewall and it's proprietary code and I had to do an NDA. Recruiters don't care about that. Foundation of open source is people. I would say these days, 99.98% of my commits on GitHub are markdown files, and maybe YAML and here and there. I think the best way is to look for help wanted tickets. There's issues in GitHub.
Justin, to begin the conversation, my audience is college going folks, mostly first year and second year students. So let's just begin with what is open source?
Open source is, depending on who you are, it could be multiple things. A lot of people like to think that open source is, if it's on GitHub, it's open source, which is it's not true. It really depends on the license. The license is defined, the definition of open source is defined and championed by the Open Source Initiative, opensource.org. And they basically have 10 rules that make an open source license what it is. I think one of the most important things is the non-discrimination, meaning that if a really bad organization wants to use your software, there's nothing you can do about it. And I think that's a good thing because without it, it wouldn't be open and there wouldn't be any, there'd be more resources going towards who can use the software and who can't rather than just innovating. So that's what open source is. It's defined by the Open Source Initiative. You can join for I think $40 a year, and you can vote for who you want to represent the organization. And yeah, I mean that's the way I define it. It's not what you see on GitHub. It's the license inside the repo.
So how can somebody into college learning CS get involved with open source? How can they start?
I think the best way is to look for help wanted tickets. There's issues in GitHub that have help wanted on them, and I think that's the best way. But if you really, really want to get involved, I think the best way to do that is to get involved with the specific community, joining their Discord or whatever they use for, just whatever they use to communicate, because a lot of maintainers, they really get annoyed with these hit and run pull requests. Oh, I found a typo. I contributed open source, merge it as soon as possible, which it's just okay, yeah, that's great, but join our community and help others on board as well, just the way we did for you. So honestly, I think you could do the numbers game and just submit a bunch of PRs to a bunch of different projects, and maybe they all get accepted. But if you look at popular projects, you'll see that there's hundreds of pull requests that are just in there. So if you want to become one of those that just sit there and really don't get closed out, they just sit there in a boneyard, so to speak. I think it's better to just get involved and find those help wanted, not what you think should be fixed, unless it's a really important security issue. But changing the color of some component, it just doesn't, you're not doing any, not doing anyone any favors by doing that. It's just gonna stay in the pull request boneyard.
Following up to this question, you mentioned that folks should be involved with the community. They should look for longer term contributions as compared to just hit and run pull requests. So I want to ask you that why should folks contribute to open source?
Recruiters are looking, we're talking to college students. Recruiters are
Right.
looking, they're not looking for, oh, I did this at this internship, but you can't see it because, it's behind a firewall and it's proprietary code and I had to do an NDA. Recruiters don't care about that. They want to see what you're recruiting, what you're actually doing on either GitHub, GitLab, or whatever open source code host, because that's how they see how you interact with people. And if you're not a good person, then they're gonna like stay away from you. It's not about the quality of your code, but the quality of the way you treat people. And yes, your quality of code is definitely important, but if you're fighting with people in the community, that's a real red flag for them, and they're just gonna be like, I don't know about that. So yeah, recruiters are not looking for stories of what you worked on behind a firewall. They want to see actual code and actual interactions with different people. This is what I've been told by recruiting people, like in the organization I work at, as well as others. So this isn't me just like saying it to say it. It's, is there a way that you can get a job without having code online? Sure, absolutely. If you graduate from Harvard or some really reputable company or college, I'm sure you can get a job fairly easy. But for me, I was self-taught, and a lot of people are self-taught, and a lot of people just, even if they go to a really good college, how some that doesn't guarantee a job, especially in this market right now, with the economic downturn in the United States, which is, bringing down, the entire financial system, so to speak. But yeah, I mean, honestly, that's your best bet, is to be a not just a good programmer, but a good person online.
Right. I totally agree with you. So to contribute to open source, is it necessary that we should know how to code?
No, because one thing that I forgot to mention, um, when you asked me what was open source, the foundation of open source is people, and there are a lot of people that are not committing code. They are running the organizations that help, like the Python Software Foundation. You don't see the people that are running that foundation and getting the funding for PyPI and all these other programs, because one, they don't want that recognition, and two, it's not in a Git commit. They're doing it behind the scenes, and without their contributions, whether it's the Python Software Foundation, the OSI, the Open Source Initiative, the Apache Software Foundation, all of these people are building programs that are allowing these to incubate and sandbox, incubate and graduate projects that billions and billions of dollars of economic um, impact is having. They're dealing with the Log4j issues. They're talking with think tanks and all these other foundations that fund the software that we all take for granted. Like when you do MPI, npm install or pip install, you see like on your screen, in your terminal, you see like, oh, you're downloading this and downloading that. And it's really easy to be like, oh, yeah, this is just bits, these are just bytes. But it's not. It's people, not just the person who coded it, but the person that found the funding to make sure that this
Hmm.
package on your computer is secure. And a lot of people, including me, I'm not going to pretend like I knew this all this time. I always thought like, oh, open source is magic, and everyone, it's just a bunch of programmers, which it's just not the case. So yeah, definitely, being a developer is very important, but we can't take away from those who do the non-code contributions, and you can do both. In fact, if you're doing both, if you're a maintainer of a very popular project, you're doing both. You're getting the funding. You are working with the community to solve code of conduct issues and this and that. Like, it's not just like, you git, commit, push, and that's open source. It's people that are really behind everything and are making sure that everything runs smooth. And we all take it for granted, including myself. We do take open source for granted, and if we really want it to be here for the next century or so, things will change like anything. But I think the foundation of open source has a long way, or a long runway, to mature even more and become more and more stable, and innovation continuing, and that's going to be done with people.
So, to an open source project, what is the value of someone who is doing a code contribution as compared to someone doing a non code contribution? Are they equal, or is someone more valuable?
No, I don't think it's like you need both, right? It's this balance of, without the developers, you don't have any code. Without the people creating the funding, you don't have secure software. So it's really not a matter of who does better work or who's more impactful. It's just yin and yang, or maybe that's not the right way to say it, but it, both are needed. You can have a car, but if it doesn't have wheels, then it's really worthless. And I think vice versa. If you have wheels and not a car, it's really kind of useless. So, um, code contributions and non-code contributions, there is no, oh, this is better than that. It's just really comes down to, you know, what what is the project you're working on? What impact is it having on the overall open source supply chain? And I think it's like comparing projects. Even comparing projects is like not even a great thing, because it's there's so many dependencies that make different projects what they are. There's all these components. So honestly, it's just everything in the open source community is so dependent on everything else. There's a XKCD comic called number 2347. I have it tattooed on my wrist, so I always remember, just for things like this. Like, I have to remember, like, hey, it's not just one person. It's all of us that keep this supply chain humming, and this mountain of different dependencies that are on top of each other, um, together. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of the way I think of it.
So, as you mentioned earlier, Justin, that recruiters are looking for folks who have done work in the open. So, does a non code contribution stand a chance to get you an internship or a full time role?
Yeah, I do think so. There are ways of uh, showing your work in that capacity, whether it's creating a newsletter or creating a blog that shows what you've talk about what you've been doing. So there's different ways to do it without having to commit code. Better yet, I mean, you can commit code. You create a blog with Jekyll or Hugo or whatever static site, and commit, markdown, so it shows that, hey, you're code literate in some fashion. Um, I would say these days, I would say 99.98% of my commits on GitHub are markdown files, and maybe YAML and here and there. But in terms of like, PHP, what I'm aging myself, but I came up in the early 2000s, right, in PHP 3 and 4. And yeah, I mean, that was kind of like my thing. But, as my career has progressed, I find myself less and less in a code editor and more in a browser or on Zoom calls, and trying to figure out ways we can uplift our dependencies that we all really take for granted.
So just to get an idea, what all comes under non-code contribution? Basically, what can folks do which counts as a non-code contribution?
So a good way to think of non-code contributions as, like, from speaking from personal experience. So I've started when I was working at a CDN, Mac CDN, we created a service called Bootstrap CDN. And a lot of that in the beginning was me writing a PHP app, and shortly after, as it took off, people took that, my partner Josh took over the responsibility of doing all the coding, where I was more focused on making sure that, our engineering team and our sales teams were happy, because, our sales teams were like, why are we giving away this free service? I don't understand this. So being that kind of diplomat, really, that was the non-code contribution. So when over 8 million sites are using this project, and convincing that to your engineers that are dealing with servers that are tipping over in Europe, and sales guys and gals going, I don't understand, why are we doing this? Why are we putting resources towards this? Until, a couple months, years go into the project, and people go, oh, you do Bootstrap. That's how I know you. Because, they're doing cold calls, and we're this bootstrap company. We didn't have any VC funding. So, getting our name out there was done through these non-code contributions of donating infrastructure. So that's one way that non-code contributors can be impactful, is donating infrastructure. The company you work for, going to them and saying, hey, we should have an open source program where open source developers get our product for free. And that's what we're doing at SourceGraph with so many different projects, Fedora, and yeah, I can go into it. But the other thing that's very popular, or for me at least, I think it's becoming more popular, is design. I was the art director for the Bash logo as well as the Z Shell logo. And, it was really interesting because I thought it was going to be pretty simple to do. But, coming with my diplomatic hat on, you got to understand, like, these communities have been together for 30 plus years, and someone coming in saying, oh, I think this is how we should have the logo look, and they're just like, number one, who the hell are you? And number two, no, so working for months. I mean, with the Z Shell logo, it was off and on for a couple of years. Like, it was insane. Like, you look at the logo and you're like, oh, that's pretty simple. I can do that in an afternoon. But it's not about the design. It's about the diplomacy and getting people bought in and not pissed off. Because I mean, there were some people that were just really upset. They're like, I don't like the direction of this logo, and it caused some friction. But at the end of the day, it was fine. You know, their Wikipedia page uh, finally had an identity, and yeah, I mean, I just got the company I was working for at the time, with MaxCDN for Bash and Reblaze for the Z Shell. They sponsored it. No code was involved. It was strictly art direction and working with the design team to come up with something that really made a big impact. Like before Bash, everyone had their own logo for Bash. So there was this mixed identity of like, okay, that's a terminal, and it has a dollar sign, and then another one would have just be completely different. So now if you type Bash into a YouTube video, you'll see consistently the Bash logo, which is very important from a non-code contribution point of view. It's very important, and not even just it's important period, because it has that identity. It has that that legitimacy, that, you know, that stamp of approval of this is a Bash video, you know, like, and yeah, it's just like a quick glance, and you go, oh, that's the Bash logo, or yeah, I know what that is. That looks very familiar because everyone's using that. So that's another non-code contribution. Another code contribution I've done in the past is documentation. Documentation is so important in order to gain and retain maintainers. You know, if you look at the past Stack Overflow surveys, sorry, if you look at this past Stack Overflow surveys, you'll see one of the biggest frustrations is documentation. And I think the reason that is because developers are more like, you figure it out. You know, it's very
Right.
rare you see really great documentation. I mean, one of the greatest documentations that I've ever seen, and it might sound biased, but the Bootstrap docs are like so well done. And I think that is a big reason why they did so well. They took off, is because from day one, the documentation was on point, because it was a project built inside of Twitter and then exported into, you know, the outside world. So yeah, I think that documentation can make or break a project. So if you're not comfortable writing or committing code at the moment, look at the docs. How can the docs be better? What are the code examples that can be implanted, or are there images that could be made to make it a lot clearer? All of these things, which a lot of developers just don't want to deal with, and where non-code contributors really shine. And I would say those are like the three things that I can speak for. There's many more out there, but yeah, I mean, fundraising, I've done that as well. You know, getting money for different projects with Open Collective, and you know, yeah, there's a lot, but I don't want to spend the whole time going over it. But yeah, those I think are three really great ones.
Awesome. That's a great answer, Justin. So what's your background like? You mentioned PHP in the beginning. Now you mentioned design. So what's your background like?
Yeah, so I started my career building websites for like local punk bands. Um, and I would just, this is before Git, this is before everything. So I would just, I had uh, I had a server that was a patch, it was a lamp stack, and I would just basically cookie cutter sites for different bands. Um, and I would also do design for them, and um, yeah, that's kind of how it started, and it then went into um, I started doing uh other web design stuff for like clients. But at the end of the day, like it just wasn't like in the beginning, it was so cool, like inserting data into a MySQL database. Like the first time I did that, I was like, and I know it sounds really like amateur right now, but back in the day, I was just like, holy crud, that is the coolest thing ever. And then deleting that, just doing a total crud workflow, and just like, wow, this is amazing. So, but after a while, I just kind of got bored, and just, I just didn't push myself to do, go to the next level of, whether it was PHP or whatever, I would say I ended my engineering, quote unquote, very air quotes, so people listening and they don't see it. It's I'm a failed engineer. I wrote a lot of when I was doing system administration. Um, I was doing a lot of Bash for automation, and Bash is so that's the reason I did the logo, is because a lot of people like to go, not a lot, but some people will like go look down and be like, why would you write that in Bash? You should be doing it in Go or this and that. And it's just like it always starts with the Bash script, and it just stays with the Bash script. So yeah, I still write a little Bash here and there, just to like automate some little things. But yeah, I mean that's pretty much my programming days, so to speak. Was not it, I was good enough, but I saw in my bosses at MaxCDN saw that I was really good at developer advocacy and relations, and that's kind of where I went, where I was more empowering open source developers to uh, build cool stuff, and we would find some way to support them. So that became more of a priority than building my own things, because I knew I had the limitations, and that was like it was hard to admit, because it's kind of looked down sometimes, or there's some type of stigma where it's like, oh, you don't code, so what are you doing here? But over the years, I've gained the respect because I've delivered it over and over and over again, in terms of huge impacts in the open source community. I mean, I know that sounds like really like very like, okay, buddy, like, that's you're kind of, tooting your own horn, but at the same time, like I built a service, Bootstrap CDN, that is used by 8 million sites, has done over 4.3 trillion requests, like huge scale. And um again, I would say 90% of my time on that was non-code rather than code. I guess the way I should say this is, a lot of people that were listening to this um podcast, or yeah, it's a podcast. Yeah. You're going to start your career as a coder, and you're going to love it. And some of you will continue on that path. and some of you will go to like a product management um, direction, and you shouldn't be afraid of that, and you shouldn't feel ashamed of that, because everyone throughout their career grows, and there's always forks in the road, no pun intended. And you just go down those, like if you told me like I would be doing, you know, open source program office or manage, if I was a open source program manager like 10 years ago, I'd be like, number one, what is that? And number two, I know that I would be an engineer, like I would be building things. So I think it's very important to remember that just because you graduate with a degree in something, it doesn't mean that's what you have to do for the rest of your days um, in your career. And don't be afraid of that, and learn quickly. I wish I learned more quickly, is to learn to let go of things and move on to things that make you more impactful. Because, not to sound grim, but we were here for a relatively short time, and you want to make sure that you can look back and go, I did some really awesome things, whether it's code or non-code. It's just do what you love, and don't be afraid of what other people are going to think if you stop writing code.
You mentioned a very interesting thing about that you're not coding, so why are you here? So have you ever felt that imposter syndrome working with developers and coders and you are not coding yourself?
Yeah, in the beginning for sure, but as my career's gone on and people have seen what I have done, it's like it's a non-issue now. But yeah, absolutely. When I was doing developer relations, and I was talking to developers, and they were talking about technologies that, like, I was like, I mean, I've seen that on Hacker News, but I never played with it, and I don't know. But you know one thing that my good friend David Hensel said, he's like, you're not there you're not there to understand every single technical thing. You can be honest and say, I heard of that, but I never experienced, rather than just going, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of imposter syndrome. um but at the end of the day, when I just what I just said is like, you got to know what you're good at, and if I can empower that developer and get him or her money in their open collective, or a logo, or some type of artwork, or get them connected to someone else, they're going to care more about that than talking about some dependency, or some class in some program, that yeah, it's just know what you're good at, and the imposter syndrome slowly moves away.